We're calling all Catholics to help us complete a spiritual bouquet of 100,000 First Saturdays by the 100th anniversary of Our Lady of Fatima's request, December 10th, 2025. Please ask all of your friends, family, and parish to sign up. And don't forget to update your status every month at fatima.org/100 by 100.
This word concrete is another modernist trick. As if the rules don't apply in any actual situation. They're just rules like Platonic ideals up in the sky, but when you get down to the real world of concrete reality, well, then the rules become a little fuzzy, don't they? That's his thinking. I earnestly ask that we always recall a teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas and learn to incorporate it in our pastoral discernment. Although, he says, there is necessarily the general principles, the more we descend to matters of detail, the more frequently we encounter defects. The principle will be found to fail according as we descend further into detail, end quote. That is an outrageous abuse of St. Thomas, because what St. Thomas is teaching here is that you have the basic precepts of the natural law. Don't commit adultery. Don't cheat on your wife. And then you have more complicated situations where those basic precepts really don't even apply, but something more particular arises. Usury, for example. Back when money was fungible and didn't create interest and was not an income-producing asset, it was immoral to charge interest. It would be like saying to someone, I'll give you a loaf of bread if you give me 2 loaves tomorrow. But when money became income-producing, when it threw off interest, and you lend money to somebody and you lose that interest, well, then the application, thou shalt not steal, became more complicated because now you're giving away an income-producing asset. So those are the kinds of details St. Thomas is talking about, applying the natural law to new situations. Adultery is not a new situation. It always was and always will be wrong to commit adultery. He lies here when he cites St. Thomas Aquinas for this proposition. Paragraph 305. For this reason, a pastor cannot feel, according to Bergoglio, that it is enough simply to apply moral laws to those living in irregular situations as if they were stones to throw at people's lives. These are the words of a demagogue who tries to turn the commandments into a stone. What a reversal. Our Lord, in his mercy, says to the woman taken in adultery, I forgive you, sin no more. He did not throw stones at her. The Pharisees were going to throw stones at her. He upheld the moral law after he forgave her. And then we have the footnote to 305. Everybody cites this footnote, but what I've just read you is the real problem. The footnote just states the conclusion. In certain cases, says the footnote to 305, this can include the help of the sacraments. Hence, I want to remind priests that the confessional must not be a torture chamber, but rather an encounter with the Lord's mercy. A torture chamber. So a man comes in and says, I cheated on my wife. What is the priest to do? Tell him to go receive communion? Only if the man repents. But if he says, I'm in a second marriage and I intend to go on having relations with my fake wife, the priest can't give absolution. He wants the priest to give absolution. But then, here's the crown jewel of this nonsense. Paragraph 307. In order to avoid all misunderstanding, I would point out that in no way must the church desist from proposing the full ideal of marriage, God's plan in all its grandeur. This is how the modernist works. He pays tribute to the thing he has just destroyed. It's what they always do. Oh, in order to avoid all misunderstanding, I am affirming what I just denied. Or, on other occasions, they will deny what they just affirmed. It's the same game the modernists have been playing since they first emerged in the church. Now, as we all know, he later pronounced that the only correct interpretation of Amoris Laetitia is the interpretation of the Buenos Aires bishops, which I believe he got them to issue. It's no coincidence that it was those bishops that came out with this interpretation. Here's their interpretation, which he published in the official Acts of the Holy See. Quote, in more complex cases, when a declaration of nullity has not been obtained, in other words, two people are living in adultery in a so-called second marriage, the above-mentioned option, living chastely together as brother and sister, may not in fact be feasible. Nevertheless, a path of discernment is still possible. I'll get to discernment in a minute. If it is acknowledged that in concrete cases, there are limitations that mitigate responsibility, especially when a person believes he or she would incur a subsequent fault by harming the children of the new union, Amoris Laetitia offers the possibility of having access to the sacraments of reconciliation and the Eucharist. Translation: when two people are living in adultery in a fake second marriage, they can continue to have marital relations if it would harm the children if they didn't have marital relations. This is the authentic interpretation of Amoris Laetitia, according to Bergoglio, published in the Acts of the Holy See. Now, what does all this mean in practice? It means situation ethics. Whether you follow an ethical precept, even if it's a negative precept of the Ten Commandments, depends upon your concrete situation. Everybody has a concrete situation. Everybody can fashion an excuse. So the sixth commandment becomes a benchmark for self-improvement, not an invariable command of God to which there are no exceptions. On that score, here's what he said to the Jesuits during a meeting last August. In Rome, I know a priest who works with young homosexuals. It is clear that today the issue of homosexuality is very strong. You think. And the sensitivity in this regard changes according to historical circumstances. Here we go again, relativizing a moral norm. But what I don't like at all in general is that we look at the so-called sins of the flesh, the so-called sins of the flesh, with a magnifying glass, just as we have done for so long for the sixth commandment. If you exploited workers, if you lied or cheated, it didn't matter, and instead sins below the waist were relevant, end quote. This is another thing that is typical of the modernist, the false alternative. Well, you don't care about lying or cheating, so how can you condemn sins of the flesh? Another demagogic trick. But sins of the flesh involve lying and cheating. Cheating and lying to your spouse, to your children, to your neighbors, to yourself. The institution of divorce itself is one big lie. Vatican II, he doesn't follow this part of Vatican II, called it the plague of divorce. Now, he doesn't stop, as we know, at garden variety adultery in relations between men and women. He's even more obsessed with normalizing sodomy. Remember the midterm Millatio of the Synod Fathers in 2014? A document they didn't create, that he and his henchmen created, which they were told was their midterm report? Here's what it said. Homosexuals have gifts and qualities to offer the Christian community. Are we capable of welcoming these people, guaranteeing to them a fraternal space in our communities? Are our communities capable of providing that accepting and valuing their sexual orientation without compromising Catholic doctrine on the family and matrimony? Now, that document sparked outrage among the Synod Fathers. They rebelled against it, but he insisted that this document be included in the proceedings of the Synod in 2015, even though one commentator of the mainstream, I won't name him, called it the most shocking document in the history of Rome.